How many of y'all are local to Nashville? Local to the area? Okay, a couple folks. So anybody who's here knows that we just went through something we call Hell Week in the industry, and that is the music industry, and we call that CMA Fest. So we have a big festival every year called CMA Fest, and I am a musician by trade, and I know some other folks in here are as well, and so it can be a pretty trying time for some of us. And this was my first year actually playing the festival. I'm a hired gun guitar player and bass player, and normally I would turn down a gig that had anything to do with Broadway, but I needed the cash. So my story, setting the scene, it's CMA Fest. It's a Thursday, Friday, Saturday night. I'm playing downtown every night. And so the first night, it was pretty all right. I was like, okay, we're here, we're downtown. But something about living in Nashville, I feel like the longer you live in Nashville, the more Broadway gives you the ick, right? It's all bachelorette parties, and especially as a sober person, like people drinking and all this chaos, and it's just jam-packed even more than normal, okay? And the first night, I was like, all right, I can be with this is cool, whatever. The next night, it's about 9 o'clock, we show up to the rooftop bar on Broadway we're supposed to play, and they say, hey, we're 2.5 hours behind schedule. And I don't know. My practice has been very strong for many years, but that was trying, y'all. And I started to notice this thing that was happening. So each day that I wound up back on Broadway, back in the CMA Fest bubble, I noticed my mind being really judgmental, right? A bachelorette party would pass and I would be like, ugh. Or I'd see someone throw up on the sidewalk and I'd be like, gross. Or I would show up to the gig the next day and they would say, hey, we're 2.5 hours behind again. And I would be like, why do I even do this? All of this hatred, all this anger, frustration started bubbling up in my head. And I just noticed the more time I spent on Broadway, the more my mind became inclined towards aversion to that. And so it was really interesting as somebody who practices meditation to watch my mind start to experience so much hatred and start to experience so much judgment. And so my practice for myself was when I noticed that I was feeling judgmental about a bachelorette party or things like that, I would try to find some joy. I would be like, oh, they're having a great time. Or if I saw somebody who was not having a great time, I would try to bring some compassion and be like, oh, sweet bean. Like, I hope you feel better. Not saying this to these people, but internally trying to meet my hatred with what I know is the opposite, which is loving kindness, which is compassion, which is joy. And it's a great practice, but it takes a lot of work to be able to see when hatred is present, when the mind is doing something like spewing judgment, right? Which brings us to the topic for today, which is mindfulness of mind. Okay, stay with me. So we've been, over the course of the past several weeks, going through something called the Satipatthana Sutta. And a sutta is just a fancy word for a teaching of the Buddha that's been passed down from generation to generation. And you'll notice when we read through it, it's really repetitive. And part of the reason for that is because these suttas were passed down orally for a really long time, and the repetition was a good way for people to remember it. Now that they're written, it's just repetitive. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about the suttas. But this particular sutta is the Buddha's teaching on mindfulness. We're like, oh yeah, we know that word, right? We all know the word mindfulness. I'm assuming you know it if you showed up here today. Mindfulness is this like big superpower that's supposed to make us all zen and cool and nothing will ever bother us, right? unfortunately not the case. There's a lot to mindfulness. And in this sutta, there's actually 4 different foundations of mindfulness that the Buddha outlines. And if I have to say a cliff notes on mindfulness, mindfulness is a practice. It's not an experience. Okay? We're kind of thought in this culture to think of mindfulness as an experience. But I really want you to frame it in the way of a practice. Mindfulness is the brain gym. It's where we go to learn how to be with whatever arises. And so the first foundation of mindfulness is breath and body, which we literally just practiced. Mindfulness of breath, mindfulness of body, being here. And there's a lot of different parts of that. There's mindfulness of the parts of the body. There's mindfulness of the breath. There's mindfulness of our nature to get old and age and die. And it can be a lot. But it's a great way to start to practice mindfulness. The second foundation is mindfulness of feeling tone. And all that is mindfulness of when something we're experiencing is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Motorcycle on the road. It could be seen as unpleasant. The mind will just log it as one thing. A pedal tavern going down Broadway when it's 11 p.m. and I'm supposed to be home already, unpleasant, right? My dog this morning, pleasant, right? We start to just log these things naturally into pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So being aware of when the mind is doing that is a great way to practice mindfulness. We're going to start on the third foundation of mindfulness tonight, which is mindfulness of mind. I like to think about this sometimes as mindfulness of mind states. Mindfulness of the things the mind does that can get us tripped up, to put it plainly. So tonight in particular, I'm going to keep it super simple. We're going to talk about what is mindfulness of mind and how do we practice it. Keeping it nice and chill, and then we'll actually practice it. So starting with what is mindfulness of mind, I'm going to read directly from the sutta. Again, remember, it will be a little repetitive, but just stick with me, okay? And I'll invite you to, I think sometimes when we listen to the suttas, we try to figure it out. We try to understand it, right? Our mind wants to compartmentalize it and intellectualize it. And so while I read this, I'm going to invite you to let go of any need to understand. I want to invite you to simply listen and see if anything sticks out, okay? You don't have to understand the whole thing. Here we go. And how does a mendicant dwell within the mind, observing the mind? It is when a mendicant understands that with greed, that a mind with greed as a mind with greed, and a mind without greed as a mind without greed. They understand the mind with hate as mind with hate, and mind without hate as mind without hate. They understand mind with delusion as mind with delusion, and mind without delusion as mind without delusion. They know constricted mind as constricted mind, and scattered mind as scattered mind. They know expansive mind as expansive mind, and unexpansive mind as unexpansive mind. They know mind that is not supreme as mind that is not supreme, and mind that is supreme as mind that is supreme. They know mind immersed in samadhi as mind immersed in samadhi, and mind not immersed in samadhi as mind not immersed in samadhi. They know mind freed as freed mind, and unfreed mind as unfreed mind. So the first thing I want to point out in this sutta is dwell within the mind, observing the mind. What does that mean? I think it can seem a little complicated, but I'm here to make it super simple. It's just getting up close and personal with what's happening in the mind while it's happening, right? So it's not necessarily hindsight, like me looking back and being like, wow, that bachelorette party was really loud and drunk. There was a lot of hatred in my mind in that moment. It's in the moment, up close and personal with the hatred, saying, oh, hatred's present, right? That's all this is. It's that observer part of the mind. Have y'all ever experienced that? That part of the mind that can kind of watch everything that's happening, all the processes. In meditation, a good example of this is I always like to draw my little diagram. We have our anchor in meditation, the breath, whatever, and then we wander, we notice, and we come back to the anchor. So the observer, this part of the mind that is able to contemplate the mind within the mind, is that part where we notice. It's the mind going, oh, my mind wandered. Boop, gonna bring it right back. That little part right there, that's all we're talking about. That is dwelling within the mind, observing the mind. Does that make sense? So next we go through this giant list of mind states: greed, hatred, delusion, scattered, constricted, and it just keeps going on and on. So I want to kind of just break that down a little bit. So the first three that come up are mind with greed, mind with hatred, and mind with delusion. And these are actually some of my favorite things to talk about because this comes up in the Dharma a lot. And the Dharma is just the word for the teachings of the Buddha. So originally, these three things were called the flames, the three flames of the mind. And one thing I like to point out is that awakening or liberation or just like peace and contentment, the Pali Sanskrit word for that is nibbana, and it's actually a cooking term to remove a boiling pot from the flame, from the heat source. So I love to think about these three things as that heat source, right? Greed, hatred, and delusion. When we can lift ourselves off of these things, we experience peace and contentment. So the first one, let's talk about greed. So you'll hear these called poisons or flames. So the first one is greed. This is sometimes called lust. I like to think about it as an unquenchable thirst. An unquenchable thirst. This can be addiction for anybody who's in recovery. This can be wanting a new car. This can be wanting to be in a relationship with someone. And how we know greed is present is because we mistakenly feel like our happiness depends on reaching that goal or obtaining that thing. And then once we get there, we realize it doesn't bring us lasting happiness. And so then it arises. I find this in my career a lot, right? As a musician, I'm like, okay, once I play the Ryman, that's gonna be it. And then you play the Ryman and you're like, okay, once I play Bridgestone, that's it, right? There's always something around the corner that we think is going to bring us lasting happiness and satisfaction. Symptoms that greed may be present are a lack of contentment, a lack of compassion or generosity towards others. And I like to simply label greed, like I don't go into my mind and say greed is present, because it's kind of like a loaded word. I just say wanting, right? So if I notice that greed is present, I just go, oh, wanting. So that's the first one. Then we go to hatred, which was very present for me on Broadway at CMA Fest this past weekend. So this is ill will, anger, aversion, sometimes you'll hear it called. And I call this one not wanting. Super simple. We've got wanting, we've got not wanting. The mind states of wanting, the mind states of not wanting. So an example of this is I have misophonia. Some of y'all have heard me talk about this. It's this weird thing where certain noises, especially people chewing really loud, just sends me into a fit of rage. And so I'm like, not wanting. Like every time I go to the movies with my sister-in-law, it's like not wanting, right? Or maybe you have a job that you don't care for, not wanting. Maybe during meditation, the traffic is loud and you're like, not wanting. This is a meditation center. It's supposed to be quiet. So this is us pushing away feelings of discomfort and unpleasantness, fear, hurt, loneliness, and treating them like the enemy. Symptoms that hatred has kind of showed up are habitually resisting, avoiding or denying unpleasant feelings, also avoiding, denying, or resisting circumstances and people we don't like. Finding ourselves in conflict everywhere we go, even if that conflict is ourselves, even if the aversion is self, right? I love me some self-hatred, right? My sweet little brain just loves to eat that up. So we've got wanting, we've got not wanting. The next one, delusion, can be a little weird. So this is wrong understanding, ignorance of the true nature of how things are. And I call this one not here, just not in reality. An example I like to use for this all the time, I call it, the Pali Sanskrit word is papancha, which is super fun to say, but it's just the term for the proliferation of thought. Y'all ever notice how one thought will lead to another thought, will lead to another thought? My favorite example is my wife and I are in the process of potentially moving in the next couple years or so, and so we're looking at houses. And every time I look at a house here in Nashville or in Colorado where we're thinking about potentially relocating, the price tag just gets me. I'm like, whoa. So I always think I could move back to Cleveland, Ohio, where I'm originally from, where you can get a house for the price of a VCR. And then I start to think, well, there's snow in Cleveland. And my wife grew up here in Tennessee, and she's not really great at driving in the snow, so maybe I'd have to get her an all-wheel drive vehicle. And even then, oh my gosh, what if she spins out on the highway? She can't make it. She's not going to make it. And so I go from looking at houses to killing my wife in 5 seconds, right? It's this weird thing that happens. So this is not here. This is an example of delusion. Not being in reality, not being with the truth that all things are impermanent, impersonal, and imperfect. Symptoms of this, it's imperfect, all things are imperfect, impersonal, and impermanent. So delusion is ignoring that. All things are imperfect, impersonal, and impermanent. Symptoms of this are looking outside of ourselves for happiness, satisfaction, and solutions to our problems, right? Once I get a house that's in my price range, right? So it's a little bit of greed, it's a little bit of delusion, it's a little, all these things are connected. And the thing that's interesting about mindfulness of mind with this in particular is we can start to note, is greed present or is greed not present? So in the sutta, you notice he says, a mind with hate as mind with hate, and a mind without hate as a mind without hate. So not just knowing when those things are present, but also knowing when they're not present. Like in this moment, hatred is not present. Greed is present. I'm looking forward to my ice cream sundae when I get home. Like bought hot fudge, all this stuff. I'm like, yeah, wanting, right? So that's present. But most of these things are either going to be present or not present. And you'll have a fun little smattering, little sampler platter of all of them most of the time. The next thing he talks about are these energetic tones, and these are not as much like you got it or you don't. These are more somewhere on a spectrum, a level, and that's constricted and scattered. So knowing when the mind is constricted, when the mind is scattered. Constricted just means so tight that things can't flow. Right? So when the mind is constricted, it's so tight, it's holding on so tight that things can't naturally flow, right? And then scattered is it's so uncollected that things can't flow, right? And I find that the constricted mind, the mind that really wants things to be a certain way and it has to be this way, can actually lead to a lot of we call it sloth and torpor, which is a weird set of words. So instead, we're just going to call it listlessness, right? So when the mind is really constricted, it gets tired very easily. When the mind is scattered, it can get really restless or anxious. So if you find that you're often anxious, or if you're in this point of self-hatred that's just tiring you out, start to examine, how much is my mind constricted? How much is my mind scattered, right? And this is not notice I'm not saying, and that's bad. I'm not saying, and you have to get rid of it. I'm saying, just notice when the mind is constricted. And notice when the mind is scattered. Notice when greed is present, when you're wanting, when you're not wanting, when you're not here. And then he goes into these 4 things that probably when I started saying them, you're like, I have no idea what that means. And that's the expansive mind, the supreme mind, the mind immersed in samadhi, and the freed mind. So these are more elements of awakening. And when I say awakening, it's really just liberation from suffering, right? I love that I said just liberation from suffering. But it's for those of us who maybe aren't as keen on like the Buddhist awakening, enlightenment thing, and we're here maybe just for some stress relief or things of that, think about this more as peace and contentment, lasting happiness, lasting peace, lasting contentment. So these are, again, kind of, is the mind expansive? Is the mind not expansive? So these are kind of those check yes or no's again. So expansive mind to me just means a mind that is willing to see beyond the current causes and conditions, willing to see from a different perspective. The supreme mind is, can I get any more like, can I get more content? Could my mind be more content? Could my mind be more peaceful? Right? And most of the time, the answers to these are going to be yes, unless you're, a Buddha or things like this. So then we've got immersed in samadhi. The word samadhi is a big one that I don't want to do a ton of unpacking on right now because that's another talk. But samadhi, just think of that as a mind that is kind of immersed in this pleasant abiding of being with what is, right? Y'all know this when you go to the park or when you're maybe like, I don't know if you golf or do something like that, when you're really in that thing and it feels very open and flowy and you're like, yeah, I'm in it. Samadhi, it's pleasant. So noticing, is the mind immersed in samadhi or is it not? And then lastly, we have the freed mind. Is my mind free or is it not? So I want to run y'all through this checklist one time, and I want to have y'all maybe go inward, see if you can be a little reflective about this, but I'm going to just offer this list, and I want you to ask yourself these questions. So in this current moment, in this very moment, observe the mind as best you can, and ask yourself, is wanting present? Is wanting not present? Is hatred present? Or aversion? Is hatred or aversion not present? What about delusion? Not here. Is delusion present in this moment? Is delusion not present? Is the mind constricted in this moment? Is the mind scattered in this moment? Is your mind expansive in this moment or not expansive? Does your mind feel supreme in this moment or not? Is the mind currently immersed in samadhi, or that pleasant focus, contentment, or not? And is your mind free or not? And with whatever arises with these things, not judging it. So if the mind is constricted, not being like, shucks, darn it, right? Instead being like, okay, the mind is constricted. If hatred is present, not being like, I'm a hateful person, I'm the worst. Just going, oh, yes, not wanting. So giving you, these are the main mind states. And like I said, most of the time we have a nice little charcuterie board of all these things happening with and independently of each other. Does that make sense? So how do we practice with that? Great information, what do we do? So the sutta goes on to say, they reside in the mind observing it internally or subjectively, or reside in the mind observing it externally or objectively, or abide in the mind observing in both internally and externally. They meditate observing the mind as liable to originate, is liable to vanish, and is liable to both originate and vanish. Or mindfulness is established that the mind exists to the extent necessary for knowledge and mindfulness. They meditate independent, not grasping at anything in the world. That is how a mendicant dwells within the mind, observing the mind. And that's another one where sometimes when I first read it, I'm like, what are you talking about? What do you mean internally, externally, or both internally and externally? And this is my favorite part about coming to Buddhism, coming to these practices of mindfulness, is every other place I have come for spiritual refuge, it has been, this is it. This is what they mean. But with the suttas and with your practice, the cool thing about this is it can mean whatever it needs to mean to you. So there's many ways to interpret this. So I'll just give a couple ways that I've seen it interpreted or that I've interpreted it. So the first one, you heard me say subjectively and objectively, or both subjectively and objectively. So this just means when we observe the mind internally or reside in the mind observing it externally, this subjectively or objectively. When we observe the mind, is it emotionally charged? Because I find that to be subjective. Is it emotionally charged? Is there me to it? Or am I observing it objectively? Am I saying, am I kind of logical about it? Am I seeing myself as just some, another body walking around that has a mind, right? So that's one way that you can interpret this. Another way, and one that kind of speaks to me a little bit more honestly, is this is in how mind states show up in our inner dialogue and also our outer actions, right? So in observing the mind internally and externally, to me, can sometimes mean observing what the mind does in here, all the stories, all the judgments, all the thoughts, and then observing how that finds its way out into my actions, right? So, for example, CMA Fest, sitting on a rooftop, it's 2 hours past my set, hatred is present, and then I notice myself reach for the cigarette, right? And so this is not just hatred internally, but externally, right? So I like to think about it that way sometimes. And the last way that I sometimes like to think about this is how mind states show up for us in our own experience and in the experience of others. Or how it could show up in others' experience, because we can't be an expert on somebody else's experience. I can't be like, Frankie's got greed, like, you know what I mean? Like, I can't do that because I don't know Frankie's experience. But what I can do is when I see, have you ever heard this thing in 12-step, we say you spot it, you got it, right? So it's like if I'm with my you know, like a friend who's really just like off in another land, not here, not present, I can notice the aversion to that in my mind, or my wanting them to be present, and then also think, oh, I wonder if maybe delusion is present for them, or hatred is present for them. And I find it gives us, at least me, some space to be more compassionate with other people's experience, knowing that these mind states show up for other people, right? Or maybe I see somebody who's crushing it, like Reverend Mikey Noshel, our guiding teacher here. Every time I see him, I'm like, man, he's doing something right. He just beep bops around and nothing really bothers him, to my knowledge. And when I see that, I notice, okay, like that's a free mind. It can be a good motivator, right? So that's some of the ways we can view this. In whatever way resonates with you, it's really just about observing the mind from multiple perspectives, opening up to seeing things in a way that's different than just our own flat, face-to-face encounter. And it's important, while we observe the mind, to also rest in the truth of anicca, or impermanence, right? So you heard in that sutta, he said, they meditate observing the mind as liable to originate, as liable to vanish, and liable to both originate and vanish. And this just means what has the power to arise has the power to pass away. Self-hatred arises. Okay, hate is present. You'll notice at some point the hatred will subside, and it will come back, and it will subside. An expansive mind may arise and pass away. So it's important to notice that, I think sometimes, especially when we're in deep periods of self-hatred, it can feel like it's always been that way and it will always be that way. Or in deep periods of wanting, or in deep periods of scattered restlessness. Or even in more pleasant states like expansive and free sometimes. We start to think, oh, we did it, we're great, we made it. And then it goes away and we're like, what the hell, right? And so it's important to know what has the power to arise has the power to pass away. And that's all he's saying here is, in my opinion, like, keep that in mind. When you notice a mind state, remember that all things are impermanent, including the mind state, including the mind. So circling it back around to CMA Fest, just kind of like walking you through how I practice this. So I noticed what mind states were present: hatred, not wanting. And I noticed that the mind was fairly constricted. I wasn't really able to open up, right? And so noticing these things is half the battle. And this is why we practice mindfulness. So it can be like, oh, the mind's doing that thing it always does. And we'll start to notice patterns, things like that. So I watch how the hatred and the constricted nature of my mind shows up in my own experience, in my actions, in my inner dialogue. And I remember that just because hate is present does not mean I'm always hateful. And one of the things I say a lot when I facilitate is meditation to me, and my practice has been seeing clearly so I can respond wisely. That's the whole practice. So I can see clearly, and when I can see clearly, I can respond wisely. And so this mindfulness of mind is a great opportunity to see clearly, without judgment, so that we may respond wisely. And just like anything else, it takes practice. So I want to open it up into a period of actually practicing mindfulness of mind. I think what I want to do tonight is focus mainly on these poisons, greed, hatred, and delusion, because I feel like they can be the most present and real. So it's simply wanting, not here. Easy squeezy, right? When the mind wanders, check it out a little bit. Wanting, not here. If you're sitting and you're like, oh, what am I going to have for dinner? That's a little bit of wanting and a little bit of not here, right? So just noting what's present, wanting, not here, and then coming back to the breath. That's what this practice is going to be. And also noticing when it's free of the poisons. Oh, heck, there's no greed. Dope, right? You could just be having a thought about a kangaroo, and you could be like, okay, delusion's present, but like hatred isn't. I love this kangaroo, right? And this doesn't have to always be on the cushion. We're going to practice it on the cushion tonight, but it can be helpful to just separate from the story in day-to-day life, right? Like, how often do my wife and I have a little moment where like I forget to do the dishes and she comes home from work and she's like, why didn't you do the dishes? And then I have all this hatred for myself because I'm awful and don't know how to do the dishes. Like, you know what I'm saying? And in those moments I can go, hatred is present. Judgment is present. And I can see clearly, so that instead of moping on the couch because I'm such a piece of crap, I can just do the dishes. Right? I don't need to write a big story about it. It's a really good way to help separate us from our inner critic, if that makes sense. Yeah, so what we'll do about a 20-minute guided meditation on mindfulness of these three flames, three poisons. So if you want to find a posture that feels suitable, go back into a period of meditation. Again, I'll guide you through it. Settling back in. Closing the eyes if it feels comfortable and safe. We'll start and end with the sound of the bell. Coming back to this settled, aware, grounded space. Taking a few deep breaths if needed. Let's start by bringing the awareness to the very top of the head. Just taking a moment to really soften the body with a quick scan. So bringing all the awareness to the top of the head as best you can. We'll slowly start to scan down and just soften any points of tension. So scanning down, unfurrowing the brow. Softening the cheeks. Unclenching the jaw if needed. Scanning into the neck and throat. Inviting softness. Letting the shoulders drop, relax a little bit. Scanning into the arms, all the way to the hands. It's so rare that the hands get an opportunity to rest. So taking a moment just to be curious about what it feels like to simply have your hands resting. Bringing some awareness to the chest and the upper back, softening if needed. The middle back and abdomen. The lower back and the belly. Again, inviting softness, not forcing it. Just inviting it into the body. Scanning into the hips. And into the point of contact with your chair or cushion. Reminding yourself that underneath that chair or cushion there is a floor. And underneath that floor is the earth. Taking anything you need from that, any support, any groundedness. And welcoming that into the body as well. And allowing this soft groundedness to find its way through the tops of the legs, to the knees, the shins and calves, tops of the feet, and bottoms of the feet. Just making an effort to rest in this soft and still body as best you can. You'll notice within this body there is movement, the movement of the breath. So bringing your awareness back to that place where you can feel the movement of this breath. Again, the rising and falling of the chest or abdomen, air passing through the nostrils or throat. Wherever you connect with this breath, just allowing all of your awareness to gather in that space. Breathing in, simply know that you are breathing in. And breathing out, just know that you're breathing out. Some may find it helpful to even label the in and out breath. So breathing in, silently noting to yourself, in. And breathing out, silently noting to yourself, out. While we're anchoring in this breath, again, you'll notice the mind wander. And for this practice, I'll encourage you, when you notice the mind has wandered, see if it has a flavor of wanting, not wanting, or not here. And simply label whatever arises as wanting, not wanting, or not here. And then come back to the breath. So each time the mind wanders, it's a beautiful opportunity to practice mindfulness of mind. There's no need to write a story around the mind state. There's no need to dwell in it. Just notice, label, and return to the breath. Over and over, this is the practice. remembering that you do not need to fix any mind state that arises. The goal is just to notice that it has arisen. And if you'd like to go a little deeper, see if you can watch it pass away. Watch the wanting arise and fall away. And then come back to the breath. We'll continue this practice in silence together for the next few minutes. And then I'll end the meditation with the sound of the bell.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noshel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.